Welcome, everyone. I'm Mindy Romero, Director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar titled Dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, the Consequences of Reshaping Access and Representation in the U.S. Of course, you all know recently the U.S. Supreme Court dismantled a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, the VRA, designed to prevent racial discrimination in voting and representation. The decision has widely been viewed by voting rights advocates and others as a major blow to federal protections against discrimination and a significant turning point for American democracy. Since its enactment about 60 years ago, the Voting Rights Act has played a central role in protecting equal access to the ballot and ensuring fair political representation for historically marginalized communities. In this webinar today, leading experts, and we're very fortunate to have an esteemed panel with us today, leading experts on the VRA will discuss the consequences of its dismantling, of reshaping access and representation in the US. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. Today is a 1-hour webinar, as I think you all know. So because of that, unfortunately, I won't be going into detailed bios. I'm going to give you their title and who they are. If you've registered, though, or if you go to our website, you'll see links to their detailed bios and their very impactful history and high level of expertise in this field. So let's start with Thomas Saenz from MALDEF. He's the president and general counsel of MALDEF. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us here today. Next is Bertrand Ross, a professor at UC Berkeley Law School, and then some as well. And Dan Vicuna, who is currently the Senior Policy Director for Voting and Fair Representation at Common Cause. And I'll also put their names and bios in the chat in just a moment as well, so you have that there. And of course, again, I'm Mindy Romero. I'm the Director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy. So we are going to go ahead and jump right on in to the questions that we have today, as we have a lot to tackle on an incredibly important topic. And of course, we'll note in an hour, we really can only scratch the surface. We will have a good conversation, but we invite everyone who's with us today to continue to seek out additional information, to follow and track what is happening with the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act. Of course, this is only one conversation of many that's happening right now. All right, so first question, and this will go to Bertrand. Thank you. Please start us off with why the Voting Rights Act was passed in the U.S. and the impact it's had on the representativeness of American elections. I know that's a big question in a short amount of time, but please give us an overview as you can on it. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Mindy. Thanks for the introduction. And great to be here with you, Dan and Thomas, on this panel. So just kind of a brief history of the Voting Rights Act. It emerged in response to decades of disfranchisement of minority communities that arose during what's labeled the Jim Crow era, an era in which states, particularly southern states, passed a series of laws that discriminated against racial minorities, disfranchised racial minorities, and subordinated them in our polity. There are a set of laws that range from white primaries, in which only white individuals could vote in party primaries in certain states. There were poll taxes that required people to pay a certain tax in order to vote. There were literacy tests that required people to prove their literacy. And then there was the background problems that weren't necessarily in the law, but had as pernicious of an effect, including racist registrars of voters that would deny individuals the opportunity to register to vote, even if they qualified, intimidation, and of course, violence. So by the time we get to the 1950s, only 20 to 25% of African Americans in the South are registered to vote. Racial minorities throughout the country, including Latinos in California and the Southwest, were also denied registration opportunities, as were Asian American communities throughout the country. We also had the issue with respect to office holding, because African Americans weren't able to register to vote. Very few African Americans were elected to office. So, for example, we had states like Alabama, in which 11% of voting age Blacks were registered to vote, and Mississippi, in which only 5% of voting age African Americans were registered to vote. So we have a response. Civil rights movement is really focused on this issue of voting. They want to get African Americans and other racial minorities enfranchised and registered to vote. And we have a series of acts in which Congress passes in the 1950s, 1957 Civil Rights Act and 1960 Civil Rights Act were designed to get at this problem. The problem was that those required litigation, case by case litigation, which was difficult to disentrench systemic and systematic forms of disfranchisement. Civil rights movement then started to engage in actions that were designed to focus more attention on this. And one of the more important actions was the Montgomery or Selma to Montgomery March that was led by Martin Luther King and others. And that ultimately led to a response, a violent response by Alabama state troopers. And that politicized and brought public attention to the plight of civil rights activists and also the voting rights. President Johnson then called for the goddamnest, most restrictive, goddamnest toughest voting rights act that you can pass. And Congress responded with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And what you see with the Voting Rights Act, which has two major provisions that we'll cover over the course of this panel, they were targeting these most entrenched forms of discrimination in voting, and their effects were powerful. Over the course of one election from 64 to 68, you see increases in registration rates in southern states by 30, 40, and 50%. It's due to the actions of federal registrar and civil rights activists to register their voters, but it's also the dismantling of literacy tests and other devices that are designed to disfranchise African Americans. But southern states and other states didn't respond by lying down. They sought out ways to break the connection between voting and representation. And so they developed means to dilute the vote, which included shifting elective offices to offices that were appointive, annexing cities, and then engaging in districting practices. The final step in the story is 1982, in which Congress responded in response to the court's actions to address vote dilution by passing the amendments to the Voting Rights Act, which targeted vote dilution in particular, and were designed to provide African Americans and other racial minorities with the opportunities to elect candidates of their choice by requiring that states engage in certain actions or prevent states from engaging in actions that denied African Americans and other racial minorities the opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. So that's kind of an overview of the Voting Rights Act as we reach the current era in which a lot of those parts were dismantled. Sorry, one last point about impact. Impacts were registration, but they're also office holding. I'll just be very brief here. We went from a period in which we had zero, very low numbers, 2.8% of Congress members in the 1960s, 1964, were members of racial minority groups. But by the time we get to the current Congress, we have about 28% of House and Senate members that are members of 28% of House members and 16% of Senate members that are members of racial minority groups. So it's had a tremendous impact in that regards as well.
Thank you very much. All right. Next question. Let's talk about now. So with the latest Supreme Court decision, and I'll ask this question of Tom and Dan. With the latest Supreme Court decision, Louisiana versus Calais, walk us through where the VRA stands now, what remains, and what has been lost in terms of protection. Tom, do you want to take that first?
Thanks, Mindy. I think it's important to note that the Calais decision is the third of a trilogy of Supreme Court decisions by the conservative majority that have cut back severely on the protections in the Voting Rights Act. The first of these cases was over a decade ago in Shelby County versus Holder, and that basically led to the dismantling of the preclearance mechanisms in Section 5 because the court held that the coverage formula that determined which jurisdictions would have to submit their electoral changes for pre-review and pre-clearance was unconstitutional. So Section 5 since then has been largely inoperative. It has been imposed in a very small number of cases by judges for temporary periods of time. The defendant jurisdictions would have to submit changes for pre-clearance, but other than that, really that part of it, absent congressional action, has been dismantled. The next case a few years ago, the Brnovich case, touched on denial cases, vote denial cases, and how to pursue them. Vote denial cases are cases challenging voter IDs, restrictions on registration, restrictions on vote by mail, other laws that would directly deny someone the ability to cast a ballot. And there, the court majority established a test for the first time for vote denial cases. It is extremely arduous and difficult to comply with for plaintiffs, making it much more difficult to challenge many of the new state laws that we see being enacted that do operate to deny folks the right to vote. And Calais is third, and it deals with Section 2. Its primary impact is on vote dilution, as Professor Ross indicated. And vote dilution means its impacts are on redistricting and on whether jurisdiction should be districted instead of at large, challenging structures that in operation deter and prevent voting by basically ensuring that minority communities don't ever have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. So the Voting Rights Act had been very effective in ensuring that you could mandate the creation of districts where minority voters did have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. And the key was, what is the choice of voters, though it did, as Professor Ross also indicated, result in a lot of folks from communities of color actually getting elected because they tended to be the choice of the voters from their communities. So Calais has made it much, much more difficult. Set a higher standard, a strong inference of intentional racial discrimination, and somehow provided political parties with constitutional rights that seem to outstrip the right to be free from racial discrimination. So this does have a devastating impact on Section 2 cases. It is still possible to pursue Section 2 cases. MALDEF is still pursuing Section 2 cases because we want to see how the lower courts develop some of the Calais decision that was not detailed well by Justice Alito. And I'll end by just saying we still see other dangers. The Section 208, which is a provision of the Voting Rights Act that provides those not literate in English the opportunity to have assistance from someone of their choice in casting a ballot. We face a problem with one circuit having decided that there is no private right to enforce that particular provision of the Voting Rights Act. We just had the Supreme Court deny review of a case out of Arkansas, which basically foreclosed any ability of private parties to enforce Section 208. So there may be more to come from this to Supreme Court, which is very concerning. Section 208 has ensured that lots of folks who are not literate in English because they're literate in another language, and folks who are not literate in English because of disabilities, it has enabled them to cast a meaningful ballot, and that is also under threat.
Thank you very much. Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Mindy, and I appreciate the invite to be here. So, the goal of the advocacy community in this space has always been to defend the core promise of American democracy, right? That every voter has an equal voice and an equal vote. But, as Thomas laid out, we've got to confront a pretty challenging reality, right? In the Calais decision, while the court technically stopped short of declaring Section 2 of the VRA entirely unconstitutional, there's no really sugarcoating what happened. I mean, this ruling represents the systematic dismantling of the most critical federal tool we had left to fight racial discrimination and redistricting. Tom described the trifecta, right? Shelby County dismantled our protective shield of preclearance, and the Brnovich case did further damage. Now Calais gutted the core mechanism we use to fight discriminatory redistricting. So what's been lost, right? Historically, under Section 2, if a congressional, state legislative, or local government map packed or cracked communities of color to dilute their voting power, civil rights advocates could challenge those maps, and they had a lot of wins. Right before the Calais decision, you saw wins in Alabama and in the original Louisiana challenge that became Calais. But under this decision, written by Justice Sam Alito, the court has handed discriminatory map makers with a pretty strong legal alibi. It ruled that state legislatures and other map makers can essentially insulate themselves from racial discrimination claims by claiming that their primary motive was partisan rather than racial. In places like the American South, where race and political party are really intertwined, that's kind of a distinction without a difference. And, in an earlier case, the court walked away from partisan gerrymandering claims in Rucha v. Common Cause. So they've stated that that's not a challenge that plaintiffs can bring. So, the court fundamentally shifted the legal standard, to prove a Section 2 violation. Plaintiffs now have to prove a strong inference of intentional discrimination rather than showing a map simply has a discriminatory effect. This is very clearly contradicts Congress when it amended Section 2 in 1982. The goal was to create a results-based standard instead of making plaintiffs find some impossible smoking gun in which legislators say, hey, I'm trying to discriminate. Obviously, they're not that dumb anymore. So the new reality is that states can now systematically carve up black and brown neighborhoods. And as long as they say, well, we're not targeting their race, we're just targeting their political party, the court's going to let them get away with it. So what remains, right? There's technically the Jingles framework for analyzing vote dilution is still in the books, but it's a lot harder, right? The plaintiffs got to disentangle party from race in a difficult way. They've got to provide alternative maps that satisfy all of the state's, quote, legitimate partisan and political goals without using race as a predominant factor. So basically, if a state says, we want all of our districts to be Republican districts, plaintiffs got to create a map that does right by communities of color, and it's all Republican, which is nearly impossible in a lot of the country. So VRA remains on paper, but in practice, burden of proof is a really difficult standard. So what's our call to action? We don't obviously treat court defeats as the end of the road. So we're kind of shifting to two urgent battlegrounds, state level voting rights acts. We're going to accelerate our work passing state VRAs. We've done so in New York, Colorado, Minnesota, that create really strong protections under state constitutions. Obviously, federal legislation is crucial, right? Got to continue mobilizing our members to demand that Congress pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and a national ban on partisan gerrymandering to try to repair the damage the court's done and eliminate that loophole that legislators now have. So Supreme Court's weak in our shield, but resolve is still strong. Going to keep fighting, keep organizing, and do right by our democracy.
Thank you, Dan. Political alibi, is the term you use there. I find really interesting. Thanks. So this next question is for Patrol Professor Ross and Tom. Let's break this down further. How do you see the congressional representation map changing going forward because of the Kelly decision and other decisions? Who gains? Who loses? And you can define that any way that you want in terms of loss and gain. Please.
Sure. It's in some ways it's easy to tell, but some ways it's hard, right? The prediction is that it gives Republicans, particularly in the South, an opportunity to gerrymander districts and in all states for that matter, gerrymander their states in a partisan way. And as Dan described, that's completely legitimate. It's interesting. We went from Rucho to the claim in Rucho that we can't come up with a manageable standard, so we're not going to do anything about it, to what seems to be the inference in Calais that partisan gerrymandering seems to be considered a legitimate tool for districting. And I think that in the short term, you may see Republican states, and you're seeing Republican states, seek to take advantage of that by first limiting the number of majority and minority districts that are drawn. They haven't gone to zero. We've seen places like South Carolina in which they refuse to draw out their majority minority districts. And I think that that's partially a result of the fact that the 2026 midterm election playing field is not particularly favorable to Republicans. And so if you seek to draw out majority and minority districts, you often do so in a way that you're trying to create more Republican districts, but that spreads out Republican votes and reduces the margin of victory in those particular districts. And that's a little bit dangerous in a time in which the election wins are going against the particular party. So they may delay, and we're seeing some delay in that action. The timing of the decision prevents some states from engaging in any actions in response to Calais. But I think in anticipation of 2028, you're going to see more aggressive Republican actions. And if a Democrat wins the presidency in 2028, you're going to see even more aggressive actions in 2030 during the midterm elections, because if history is prologue, those elections in which a Democrat is in office, or whichever party is in the office of the presidency, they tend to lose seats in the midterm election. So they may seek to press their gains in that election if the opportunity does arise. And so where I see potential long-term effects, or medium-term effects at least, is Republican gains, loss to African Americans, and in particular in the South with respect to representational opportunities. I don't think that they'll receive the proportional opportunities to elect their candidates of choice that they received before this. I think you're also going to see a loss in moderates, Republican moderates, in the South as well, because to the extent that districts are drawn such that they are clearly just Republican districts, then any chance for the moderates to peel off that district gets diminished. And ultimately, I think the harm is to the people in those districts, whether you're white or African American or any other racial background, Latino, Asian American, because those districts aren't going to be that particularly party competitive, or the congressional delegation or the legislatures. You're going to have less voice of minority parties in those contexts. I think that means less accountable government, which I think is to the detriment of everyone. So those are some of the things I anticipate going forward.
So let me speak to the impact on the Latino community that MALDEF serves. The impact for Congress, we actually saw prior to Calais, and that was through Texas mid-decade redistricting that even before Calais was issued, really reflected what would come in Calais in the shadow docket decision staying the order that would have prevented that mid-decade redistricting from going forward. The result of that mid-decade redistricting was to write out of existence a number of Latino majority congressional seats. But as Professor Ross indicated, if this ends up being a wave election for the Democratic Party, then Texas will suffer because of that mid-decade redistricting. Texas Republicans will suffer, and there will be more Democrats elected than otherwise would have been. But that is where we saw the heaviest impact for the Latino community. At least with respect to Congress, there's less of an impact for the Latino community because our population tends to be concentrated in states where we are voting with the majority party. So that's Democrats in California, New Mexico, and in the middle, but for Democrats in Arizona, Nevada, et cetera, and even voting Republican in Florida, where that's the majority party. So we don't see threats by the majority party in the states that have large enough Latino populations to create congressional districts as of yet, with the sole and very concerning and large exception of the state of Texas. So that's what we've seen at congressional level and are likely to see. Less of an impact for Latinos, except in Texas, but still very concerning impacts nationwide. What we do expect next, of course, is for them to go after state legislative seats and possibly local seats. But I did want to make one comment about the local seats because at MALDEF, we do have a Section 2 case that predated Calais, and we're still litigating it, involving Stanislaus County in California. Now, what I'll say here is that the Latino community tends to be concentrated in Western states, not entirely, but mostly in Western states. And Western states are the ones that historically have had nonpartisan local elections. So, for example, in California, all local elections are nonpartisan. And that is a hopeful feature because it takes all of the political party partisan elements of Calais out of play. Basically, California says you can't take into account partisan issues when you are drawing districts for nonpartisan races. So that means there may still be work to be done with Section 2 at local level where local races are nonpartisan. Again, that is mostly concentrated in the West, so it's still going to be an issue at local level in the East as far as attempts to use Calais to eliminate local majority minority seats as well.
Thank you very much. And I should say to the audience, to our viewers, if you have questions, please feel free to put those into the Q&A. It's a webinar, so we're using the Q&A, not the chat. And we will have some time at the end, of course, to go over those. So thank you. All right, next question. So Dan, Tom just covered some of the local, but I'll ask you to also address this. What about other jurisdictions beyond congressional? What about the state level? What about the local level from your perspective in terms of the impacts next that we can expect forward?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when a major Supreme Court voting rights case, hits the headlines, right, like Calais did, right, the national conversation almost always focuses on the horse race, especially in a midterm election year, right? Like how is it looking, blue versus red in the U.S. House, sort of count up the seats in Congress, figure out the partisan balance and kind of move on. But we know that really the health of our democracy is also measured really, a lot closer to home, right? It's, the decision isn't just a blow to federal representation. It's also kind of a local shockwave. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act doesn't just apply to congressional districts. It's been the primary legal shield protecting voters of color in thousands of jurisdictions across the country, right? From state legislative chambers to county commissions, city councils, local school boards. The ruling has cleared the way for potential silent, unchecked epidemic of local vote dilution. So looking at the state level, right? State legislatures are where the laws that govern our daily lives are written, right? They control public school funding, healthcare access, and state level voting rules themselves. Historically, Section 2 has served as a pretty massive deterrent. When state map makers, sat down to draw state Senate, state Assembly, state House lines, they knew they couldn't simply crack a growing Latino or Black community across different districts and prevent them from electing a representative of their choice. Because if they did, a federal court might strike down those state maps. Now that constraint's been pretty well shattered. In highly polarized states, partisan majorities in the legislatures can draw maps that'll lock in potentially supermajorities for the next decade. And if we challenge them, the legislators are simply going to point to the Calais playbook. They'll shrug and say, well, look, we weren't trying to dilute Black or Latino, Asian vote. We were just trying to maximize our party seats. So, treating extreme partisanship as a get out of jail free card, the court's done real damage. They've insulated state level gerrymanders from federal accountability. So, in terms of the local fights, there is a risk of the impact going deeper in county municipal governments. I appreciate Tom's providing some hope. That's good because, it's potentially where the court's evisceration of the VRA is going to be felt, acutely and quietly, right? If you think about those local county commissions, city councils that use those at-large voting systems, or carefully carved districts to completely shut out minority communities from even having a single seat at the table. That's the threat. So, hopefully, per Thomas's description, it's not going to be as difficult as I feared to fight back against those injustices. Because when a local representation is lost, local accountability, it dies, right? Decisions about which neighborhoods get flood protection, where toxic waste is zoned, how local tax dollars are spent. We don't want those made without the communities having a voice in the room. So, kind of, where do we go from here? I think, if federal courts aren't the shield, we have to pivot our strategy to the states. Like I mentioned, I think we got to look at those strong state voting rights acts, which really do apply to the state districts and to localities, and to explicitly outlaw racial and partisan vote dilution and map drawing. I think it's a good idea to take the map drawing pen out of the hands of partisan politicians, establish independent systems for state legislative and local districts. Supreme Court walked away from protecting local voters, but Common Cause and our allies aren't. So, the fight's moved to state houses and city halls, and that's where I know the community will meet it.
Speaking of hope, you're both giving hope, all of you. Thank you. All right. So this question is actually for each of you. I'll ask each of you to respond. What do you think is the reaction of the American people to this decision? And this is still early. Survey data is limited, all of that. But from what your sense is on the ground, for decades, the VRA was publicly recognized, right, by media, history books, school textbooks, as an enormous accomplishment in the advancement of a representative democracy in the U.S., right, as progress. How does the Supreme Court decision, square with the public's understanding of the VRA? Is this understanding being reframed? By whom? What does this look like? And feel free, Dan, you just went last, so maybe I'll ask Professor Ross to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that Shelby County was a huge blow, right? That was the one that was kind of the sent the shockwaves across, the United States civil rights communities, racial minority communities, because it was kind of the linchpin of the Voting Rights Act. And once that decision was made, it just felt there was kind of a sense of, resignation by some, hopeful activities by others to continue to enforce it. But I think we all kind of knew what we were up against. A court that didn't seem to be that sympathetic with civil rights laws. They didn't seem to be that sympathetic with respect to the Voting Rights Act in particular. And the reframing has, the framing of it, or in the American mindset, I think it has been seen as the most successful and most effective piece of civil rights legislation in the history of the United States. It has been a tool that has constructed a multiracial democracy in a way that would not have been possible without it. We were able to, construct a legislatures throughout the country that represented the people. Now, did they do it perfectly? Very imperfectly. Did minorities secure equal representation in the public process? Not necessarily, but we were moving and striding in that direction. What the reframing that has occurred with respect to the conservative movement in particular is to see these forms of laws, civil rights laws, voting rights laws, as some sort of special dispensation. That it is, as was framed by scholars in the 1990s, a form of affirmative action, or as reflected in the more recent times as a form of DEI, which has, of course, been given a negative connotation. This reframing has been attempted to mobilize popular views against the Voting Rights Act. And so we get to the point where also you have extreme partisanship and polarization, such that it seems that party and party identity is the only thing that matters, which reduces in importance the importance of racial identity and cross coalitions that are designed to achieve particular goals for particular communities, particularly those that have been marginalized in the past. And so I think that that has been the reframing attempt. I don't think it's been successful. I think that there is still, the Voting Rights Act is still quite popular, even though it's been mostly dismantled. But those efforts are ongoing to perceive or to present civil rights legislation as a form of special dispensation for which things are being given to minority communities for which they are not entitled to, or that are not fair, or they are perceived as unfair in some particular way. I don't think it's been successful, but that's been the effort.
Thank you. Dan or Tom, where do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, if you open almost any high school history textbook, you'll find a section, maybe a chapter dedicated to the VRA, right? It's presented, and rightfully so, as a crown jewel of American progress, right? This hard-won bipartisan triumph that finally forced our nation to live up to its founding promise of a representative democracy. And then the court effectively guts the same law. I think this creates a massive, jarring cognitive dissonance for Americans. Like, how can a law we're taught to revere as this pillar of American freedom be quietly dismantled by the highest court in the land? I mean, and the truth is, the public's understanding of the VRA is being actively, deliberately reframed. And we need to talk about who's holding the pen. I mean, I think for most everyday Americans, the reaction isn't, it's not academic. It's a mixture of kind of exhaustion, growing cynicism. The average voter might understand like the hyper technical legal shift from results-based standard to an intent-based standard, but they do understand when the rules of the game are being rigged. So I think it's fostering a deep corrosive cynicism and distrust in the court and our democracy.
Thank you, Tom.
So I think there's two foundational elements behind the trilogy of decisions that the general public, if presented with them, would reject, though there's still work to be done. And those two are, first, this assertion, or it is an assertion, I don't actually know if they believe it, by the majority, that racial discrimination no longer occurs in this country, at least in the voting arena. I think that folks generally have the visceral sense that that's just false. There has been improvement, obviously, because of the success of the Voting Rights Act. But I think that the general public, the majority of it, would reject the notion that we have somehow come out of the discrimination era and all is well. And they're constantly reminded of that by things that happen outside of the voting arena, whether it's the murder of George Floyd or murders by ICE enforcement agents. People get reminded constantly that discrimination still occurs. And I think folks generally understand that that includes in the voting arena, where there's the additional incentive of staying in power. And then the other, where I still think we have some work to do, is this notion that somehow voter fraud is so widespread that we need to put an emphasis on voting security, election security, instead of on ensuring ease of participation, facilitating participation by all eligible voters. Tomorrow night, I guess, we're going to hear from Donald Trump, and it will be full of fictions about voter fraud. It will be full of fictions about how millions of people have voted who didn't have the right to do so in the past, and it's simply false. I think at the end of the day, folks realize that the source, in this case, President who lies more than any president in our history, but others who have not a shred of evidence to support assertions of voter fraud, if folks actually put the numbers together, they will get it. But I think we still have work on our side to establish that voter fraud, as is true, has not been a significant factor in 60 or 70 years in any election in this country. And our elections are as secure as they have ever been. And the greatest threat to election security is not from ineligible voters voting, but by voters being manipulated by foreign and other sources through misinformation and disinformation. So I think the two foundational premises of these decisions, that discrimination has ended and that voter fraud is a substantial and ongoing concern, would actually be rejected by the general public. But work needs to be done in that regard in order to create the case for engaging in the legislative reform that is necessary at this point, both at congressional level and, as Dan has indicated, at state and even local level as well.
Thank you all very much. Okay, so let's talk about the path forward. I know each of you have touched on this a bit, certainly, but we'll have a dedicated question and a conversation around this. So, what are the pathways to countering the dismantling of the VRA? Who's doing what, and what are the realistic opportunities for success? We can have hope, but we also want to be clear-eyed, right, in that fight. Where is the voting rights landscape in the U.S. right now, overall, and where do you think it will be in 5 years? Maybe throw in hope as well, right? Real, with clear eyes, but also where you hope it will be, and try to make the connection to how we're going to get there.
I'll kind of defer to Dan and Tom on the CVRAs, or not CV, the State Voting Rights Act, and also with respect to litigation and policy. I'll just kind of throw out one idea that has been percolating and for which I don't think that voting rights advocates are necessarily in line with yet, but it's something that will be at least a part of the conversation. And that's, finding means by which we might move to a system of proportional representation or something along those lines. And so, the Voting Rights Act was built primarily around constructing single-member districts in which racial minorities had a greater opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. They were seen as giving racial minorities a greater opportunity to elect candidates of their choice because in multi-member districts, their vote would be diluted by the inclusion of more non-racial minority voters who tended to vote against their candidates. So these single-member districts were designed to respond to that. And now there's been a push to return to multi-member districts, to larger districts, with the goal of incorporating tools and methods of voting that would ensure a more proportional representation system. So I won't get into the exact details of it because it's often quite it's quite complex, and I know we don't have time for it. But that is one move that we're starting to see groups like Fair Vote, Protect Democracy, ProRep here in California, and academics like Guy Charles, Lee Drutman, Nick Stephanopoulos, and others seeking to advance. Now, there is quite a bit of skepticism from civil rights activists, and particularly those that represent racial minority communities, because there's a concern that this system of drawing these larger districts and proportional representation has been essentially untried in multiracial democracies, and it's unclear how effective it would be in ensuring that racial minorities have influence and at least the like influence that they had under the Voting Rights Act. So, response is, let's not sort of experiment and deviate away from what has been successful. We have the John Lewis Act that has been before Congress before. Let's revive that. But there's on the other side the Fair Representation Act, which is the act that's designed to produce more proportional representation. In the meantime, I'm quite cynical as to what's going to happen in the near term. I mentioned this in my early comments. I think that what we're going to see are, pushes back and forth towards maximum gerrymandering. And that may not happen. It's not going to happen at all before 2026. I mean, what's done has been essentially done, but we are going to see more efforts towards maximizing partisan advantage in prior to the 2028 election, 2028 election, and also prior to 2030. And I don't think that there's going to be much incentives at those points for Congress to move for a comprehensive federal solution to the problem of gerrymandering. I think you may see states acting, and I'll leave that to Dan and Tom to talk about, but I'm a little bit cynical about what's going to happen, whether anything's going to happen at the national level to respond to Calais and the maximum partisan gerrymandering, or the extreme partisan gerrymandering that is likely to follow over the next 2 to 4 years.
Thank you. Comrade Dan?
I will just begin by saying that MALDEF is an extreme doubter with respect to proportional representation. And that's because the Latino community has always and continues to show the largest participation gap in voting. That's between eligible voters and those who actually cast a ballot. And the Latino community also has a higher proportion of ineligible voters, either because they're under 18 or not citizens. So we really do depend on a single member district's circumstance to ensure adequate representation for a community that has those two gaps. So we are not going to be supporters of proportional representation unless and until there's effective investment in shrinking that gap or eliminating it, both the participation gap among those eligible and trying to shrink the gap of those who are eligible within different communities. Otherwise, our being mixed with other communities puts us at a great disadvantage. But there are efforts continuing to go forward under the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Those include reforms to the coverage formula. We're particularly keen on known practices coverage, which MALDEF put forward, which would subject jurisdictions across the country to pre-review and pre-clearance of particular practices, annexations, changes to at-large, other kinds of changes that historically, as Professor Ross included in his initial explanation of what happened before the Voting Rights Act. But these, we know, practices that have been used historically to suppress the voting rights of minorities, and they ought to be subject to preclearance wherever they come from. And that eliminates the problem of differential sovereignty that they invented, the Supreme Court majority invented in the Shelby County case. So there's still efforts at the national level. What that requires, obviously, is a new president and a new Congress. So we got to get there first, and we've got to build more and more support. Now, one way to do that, as I'm sure Dan will touch on, is I don't think there's a lot of support for partisan gerrymandering or imbuing political parties with these super constitutional rights that Alito seemed to grant them in the Calais decision. And the more and more we focus on that, I think the greater support there will be across the board. And I'll say one thing about state voting rights. States can do something, including, for example, creating more nonpartisan races at local level and making clear that you cannot use as a defense or consider partisan advantage or proxies for partisan advantage when you are redistricting for non-partisan races. But the problem with state voting rights acts, frankly, and I say this even though MALDEF was a sponsor of the very first act, the CVRA, the California Voting Rights Act, a quarter century ago. But the problem is they tend to move in states that don't really need them, because these are states that have tended to be progressive about facilitating participation of all voters across the board. They're the ones where the greatest chance to create these Voting Rights Act exists. So we still don't have the opportunity in the states that are being more and more restrictive about participation. So it's a mismatch of need and opportunity that we continue to face when it comes to state voting rights acts.
Yeah, I mean, I think Professor Ross and Thomas really, kind of touched on the main points. But I'll just I'll add we are still pushing for state voting rights acts as a way to hopefully provide a model, some momentum, and to Thomas's point, we obviously any federal reform, it's crucial, but we've got to prepare it for a friendly Congress and a friendly president. But I think it's important to maintain that momentum. Let Democrats know that if they are elected, this is something that we expect from them to pass reform, pass a national ban on partisan gerrymandering, some other reforms that are going to stop this race to the bottom among the states and do something federally. So there's a path. It's a difficult one. It's not necessarily a short-term path. Those, in addition to, I think, some research to be done about how some of these reforms, like proportional representation, ranked choice voting, if there's a way to make them to ensure that they're implemented in a way that empowers communities of color. I think these are things to look at because we kind of look at longer term solutions. So there are paths there, but we got to keep at it.
Including research, as you said as well, right? To understand them all better. All right. Let me just take us back for a moment. Those are all of my formal questions, but I'd like us to revisit the conversation around public opinion and the historic kind of perceptions that the public has had around the Voting Rights Act. And we've recognized the dissonance or the disconnect, right, that we're feeling and seeing now. And the belief that for most Americans, they still think of the VRA as something that is positive and right and monumental to our democracy and to progress. But as we move forward, I'm wondering if you have any additional thoughts, any of you, around the fact that it used to be politicians, for at least in many, many cases, right, would be concerned about a disconnect, right, with public opinion, their actions, and what the public perceives as the right path forward, right? We've talked a little bit about the changing narrative and the push and pull there, and of course, use of misinformation. But any other thoughts you all might have around the difficulty in that and the realities of that, and how much does it really actually matter if there's this disconnect? I don't think we're expecting anything to change in terms of the Supreme Court, right, and its current composition. But with other political leaders, right, that are kind of part of this dismantling, what does that look like? That a little bit more here about just that disconnect, that dissonance. Does it really matter? And and are there ways to kind of actually push back on it and push back on the misinformation as well? Thoughts?
Well, I would just start by saying part of the dissonance comes from the fact that this is really an attempt to hold on to power by groups that are losing power. They see the demographics. And I say it because a lot of that has to do with the growth of the Latino community and the Latino voting community. Latinos vote Democratic, always have, and despite whatever blip may have occurred in certain communities in 2024, Donald Trump is virtually ensured that won't recur with his policies and practices. So Latinos have consistently voted 60% for the Democratic Party. Now, we always get compared to the Black community, which votes 80+% for the Democratic Party. But last time I checked, 60% is still a landslide. And so they see what's coming. And I see it in Texas, where we have a very prominent office in San Antonio. So they are clinging to power. They are trying to hold off demographic trends that ultimately will long-term lead to their being removed from power. So when you are clinging to power, you don't adhere as closely to what popular opinion may be, because it doesn't matter to you. You are desperately taking every step you possibly can to ensure that you remain where you are, which is controlling the levers of power in the state or ultimately in the country. Texas is critical. If Texas flips because of the growth of the Latino and other communities of color and how they vote in the state of Texas, when Texas flips, it changes the map on national elections, presidential elections in the extreme and for a long period of time. And that's why a lot of this dissonance is created by desperate clinging to power.
And I
Thank you,
think part of
Tom.
the strategy of clinging to power is to create this us versus them narrative, right? That is associated with effective polarization. The idea that the other side is the enemy. And so even though we're doing things that you may not like, you are part of our team and you should adhere to what we're trying to do, trusting in your team because the other side, again, is your enemy. And so, to the extent that we construct our politics around us versus them, it breaks up the line of accountability for decisions. It allows politicians to engage in actions that the public and even their constituents do not support, because they try to paint a picture that of direness if the other side wins power, right? And so they cling to power and then they create this story of the other side being anti-American, anti-this, that if they were to gain power, it will come at your detriment. And so, this is all part and parcel of a strategy, again, and as Tom said it better than I will be able to say it, of a party that sees itself, sees its future in dire terms and seeking any way it can to preserve its hold on power.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the disconnect between the popular will and the actions of politicians is the basic problem of sort of voting restrictions, the manipulation of our districts. That there's a disconnect, and that disconnect comes without electoral consequences. Elected officials feel like they can act in whichever way they want, play to their extremes, target vulnerable communities. And because elections, outcomes have been somewhat preordained by rules and district manipulation, they're not accountable. So that's the huge problem here.
Thank you all very much. I wanted to make sure we kind of parse that out a bit more. It's important. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and move over. It looks like we've got a few questions in our Q&A. Can the panelists speak more specifically about the impacts in California? And you're all California based. So please, who would like to jump in and tackle that?
Well, I'll reiterate that the impacts of Calais will be mitigated in California because the party in power is actually the party that is supported by voters of color in California, all voters of color. So there's no incentive to break up majority Latino or majority effective Black majority districts. Now, the concern is that the Democrats will begin to spread those votes more thinly across districts to try to maximize the election of Democratic candidates. But the state is already so heavily skewed to one party that I don't see a huge impact of that. In addition, because the state has been carefully controlling what happens at local level, because obviously there are significant conservative pockets in the state of California, primarily inland. But the state has exercised pretty tight control, at least on elections issues, and I expect that to continue. So I don't foresee a huge effect on Calais in California, except that there do remain redistricting problems, including at county level. I mentioned our case against Stanislaus, and that is rendered more difficult, though with the partisan issues left out because these are nonpartisan races. So there is an impact in terms of what can be accomplished through litigation potentially, but that's still to be developed in my view.
Okay, next question. How can we mobilize voters who usually sit out in elections? So this is not specific to the VRA, but obviously very, right, important if we're talking about overall impacts on representation and voice.
I mean, I think it will. It is kind of linked to the VRA in this respect, to the extent that the federal guardrails have been removed with respect to districting in partisan direction. And one of the things that struck me with the opinion was that, we, as a legitimate districting criteria, you could, the margin of victory. A state wants to preserve a particular margin of victory for their candidates. They want to make sure that their Republican candidate wins by at least 20 points. That is a criteria that any other alternative map would have to meet. And so, to the extent that we're not only sanctioning partisan gerrymandering, but also what's called sweetheart gerrymandering, ensuring that these politicians are able to maintain their safe seats, it's gonna have a diminishing effect on participation because a driving factor in participation is competitiveness because that leads to more money coming into the district and more efforts at outreach and mobilization, more ads on TV, more information for voters, etc. And if we don't have competitive districts, that resource flow is not going to go into districts. So I think part of the issue is can we construct sort of dynamics that either whether they're at the primary level or at the general election level that are more competitive, that draw more resources and information for voters, that could be a helpful thing. But I think that at the heart of it, what people have to feel is the sense that politics and representation matters to them. Who gets elected to office matters to their lives. And to the extent that they do not feel that it matters for their lives, one way or the other, whether one party gets in or the other, the question is, why should they vote? And so I think that what we need to secure is a more representative and accountable politics. And, that requires, thinking about election systems that can ensure greater responsiveness and accountability to communities, particularly those marginalized communities, those low-income socioeconomic communities who tend to vote a lot less than other socioeconomic groups. So I think that that's at the core of it, something that American democracy has struggled with for a long time. But I think that that's something that we need to work at.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would
anyone else? Thank you.
add that at least in this election in November and maybe afterwards, we really need to try to foster and exploit the defiance vote. Every time somebody tries to prevent communities from voting, there is a defiance vote. Basically responds to, you don't want me to vote, I'm going to make sure I vote, right? And there's a significant streak of defiance in our communities, particularly, I would say, among youth who are among those who participate the least. So if we really learn to take advantage of that defiance, there could be a real backlash to some of what we see. We've seen it before where they put in place a voter ID that's clearly targeted at a community, and all of a sudden the community actually votes more than expected. And that's a defiance vote. And I think we have to take advantage of that and really learn how to foster more and more of it to make a real impact.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just add, like we talked about in the last section about, the sort of disconnect between actions of elected officials and their, the popular will. And that's why attacking these voter restrictions are incredibly important, because you can see almost a spiral, right? Where there's disconnect, and then people get cynical, they don't vote, and there's further disconnect because the voice of the people isn't really represented. So just crucial to inspire people to actually show up and think their vote matters, to attack these restrictions.
Thank you. So I'm going to move over to the question here from Angela. What can the states do? I know we've talked about state level VRAs, but what can the states do to preserve voting rights, and can states form a strong coalition?
Well, I think there is a coalition, though it's an informal one, among progressive attorneys general. And I think that has an application with respect to voting rights. I think what states can do beyond some of the post-Calais specific to Calais reforms that we've talked about is really continue to facilitate participation from every eligible voter. And that includes the same day voter registration, the election day voter registration, if you will, online voter registration available to all, attempting to ensure that every 18-year-old citizen has the opportunity, if not the obligation, to register to vote. There are steps that facilitating voting by mail. Obviously, we see that that's something that Donald Trump wants to eliminate. So we know that actually facilitates greater participation. So states can do those things that are not direct responses to Calais, but really helpful in ensuring maximum participation.
Next question. So I think we actually just talked about this a little bit. Dan just mentioned youth. But if there's anything additional here, I'll just open it up. So the question is, can the panelists share any insights about strategies or approaches to engage youth or new voters, given the general sentiment is one of disengagement? Any additional thoughts here?
I'll just reemphasize that I personally believe that the defiance motivation works with youth. That if you tell them, as is true, that they are trying to prevent youth from voting, because a lot of this is also about youth, because they know youth tend to vote more progressively. They don't want you to vote, then that is going to inspire folks who otherwise wouldn't necessarily have taken the steps to vote to participate.
And I think it's important to introduce youth in high school in particular to the logistics of the process as early as possible, right? I think that, if there was a means to provide for registration, during high school, even if they're not allowed to vote until they're 18, I think that that's an important process, or an education process for which they understand the online registration process, introducing and overcoming and dismantling any sort of the logistical obstacles to voting when they're within a system of instruction in which all of them must participate. Because when youth disperse into their own future lives, whether it be going to college, whether it be going to a job, whether it be going to particular skills education, right? It's harder to sort of to connect them to the system in the way that high schools and institutions can. So introducing them into the system, of course, increasing opportunities for civic education and their role in the political process at the high school level is something that we should always and continue to develop as we go forward, can be ways to at least lift up that youth vote, in addition to inspire them to defy the system that suggests that they should not participate.
Thank you very much. So I think we're at time. I think I'll leave it there unless you had something additional that was burning down. Okay, great. There's two other questions we didn't get to, but one is just simply asking CID to consider doing a session on proportional representation, and we will consider that. Thank you for the suggestion. And then a question about disinformation campaigns and how that could impact election officials. So if the person, I think Henry, feel free to email us directly, and I can try to get you an answer on that offline. So everyone that's joined us today, thank you so much for being here, a part of this conversation. Of course, I want to thank again our panelists, Tom Saenz, Fitzgerald Ross, and Dan Vicuna. This has been, I think, a very important conversation. We greatly appreciate all of your time and your expertise. And lastly, I'll just note, of course, we are recording this, and this will be made available if you're registered. So please feel free to share the links to the highlights reel and to the actual full recording, and we can share this conversation far beyond those of you that participated today. So thank you all again. Have a good day, and see you next time.